All right, very good. Thank you. Good morning. We do appreciate you tuning in here. We are going to be doing a class for the Nebraska Safety Council. It is going to be November 13th and 14th in Lincoln, Nebraska. And this is a webinar to kind of explain what we do and how we do it. Maybe some of the folks that should or could be included in this 2-day training. It is all based on NFPA 70E, the 2018 edition, which is the latest that we have. There is a hands-on component that we do along with that training. It is geared towards qualified people. It's also geared towards unqualified people that may be exposed to electrical hazards. It's a good introduction into what the hazards are and how we protect ourselves from those hazards. A lot of places, we talk about OSHA very briefly when we do our presentation, and we do spend a little time talking about the National Fire Protection Association, but most of it is it's meat and potatoes. We spend time talking about the hazards. We spend some time talking about the PPE, of course, and those are some of the things that are very important. We talk about being qualified, having qualified people in our workforce, and a big part of being qualified is to have the safety training and the understanding what the hazards are and the things that go along with that. I am an electrician. I've been an IBW electrician for 31 years. I am a master electrician. I carry a master's license, state of Indiana, actually County of Monroe, state of Indiana. Without getting into a bunch of detail on that, I have been in the training business. The company that I represent, National Technology Transfer, NTT, which is out of Centennial, Colorado. I've been with them 12 years. I have been out to the Nebraska Safety Council and taught a class in the past, and had a good class, had a big class, had 20 or 22 people in it. And but that's a little background on me. I've been in a lot of states. I've been in 46 states in the 12 years I've been traveling around teaching. So I've got to meet a lot of fine people. I try to have a little fun with it, tell a few war stories, and that seems to help a little bit. Kind of break some of the stuff up. It can be people don't have real high hopes a lot of times when they come into a safety class, and there's a lot of good information. And like I said, we try to keep it upbeat. Our PowerPoint show, and it's all PowerPoint. We do have a hands-on component that we do here, which I'll elaborate on a little bit. But there's 7 modules in the PowerPoint show and in the NTT book that we use. And just to give you a little idea of what the modules are, module number 1 talks about being qualified. It says the electrical safety and your electrical safety program. In Article 105 and Article 110 of the NFPA 70E, they talk about, responsibilities. They talk about what the employer has to do, and they talk about what the employee has to do. And those are some important facts. The employer has to write the safety program. They have to have, they have to provide the employee with proper PPE, which shock protection, probably a pair of voltage rated rubber gloves and a pair of leather protectors, rated test equipment. We talk about insulated tools a little bit. Then, the employer provides all this stuff and trains the employee on the hazards, shock, arc, and blast. Those are the 3 hazards of electricity. So we talk about the hazards and we get into those hazards, and that's what module number 2 gets into. So we kind of talk about responsibility a little bit. We talk about buy-in from not only from the management side of things, but from the people that are working out in the field that are actually sticking their hands in live parts. You have to have buy-in, which means, you have to understand what these things are. You have to use the PPE. And that's an important part of this. Once we get into module number 2, it talks about the potential hazards faced by electrical workers. So there again, you have to understand we have a shock hazard, and we may have a fire hazard. You have to look at both things when you get into the NFPA 70E, it talks about doing a shock risk assessment. It talks about doing a arc flash risk assessment. So we have to understand what those hazards are, and we have to have a pretty good understanding of how we're going to protect ourselves from those hazards. One of the very new and key pieces in the 2018 70E is a written risk assessment. Anytime that a qualified person sticks their hands into live parts, they have to do a written risk assessment. And we get into that. But to be able to do this assessment, it needs to be done obviously by a qualified person that understands what the hazards are. And then they have to have a good understanding of, number one, how are we going to protect ourselves from these hazards? Because we are going to deal with them. As an electrician, if I'm troubleshooting in a facility, I'm probably working on live parts. It's permissible, but we have to have the right PPE. We have to have the right skill set. We have to have the understanding that things can go bad here. And that's kind of the idea. So we give a really good, pretty in-depth when we talk about the hazards. We spend a good amount of time talking about shock and the effects of shock on the human body, even at a lower voltage and a very low current flow level. We spend a lot of time there. We talk about the fire hazard. We used to use a lot of pictures, a lot of burn pictures, and we've got away from that. We use a couple, and people need to know, what the end result looks like. I feel pretty strongly about that. If something goes terribly wrong, when we've got guys out here working on live parts, things happen very quickly. And so, when we talk about the hazards, and we do spend a pretty fair amount of time there, we get into module number 3 after we talk about the hazards. And module number 3 talks about the electrical safe work practices and procedures. And we write a safety plan. You can see there kind of in the upper corner, it talks about a maintenance work order, replacing a fuse in a 480 volt disconnect switch. So the idea is we're going to go down, we're going to troubleshoot the disconnect switch. That's the hands-on that we actually do in the classroom. So we've got PPE available. We do our inspections. We look our meter over. We talk about test equipment. But writing this job safety plan is a key part of electrical safety in the 2018 70E. It gets into, as a qualified person, when I walk out here to troubleshoot on a piece of equipment, there's a set of steps that I go through when I get there. If it's a disconnect, I know I'm going to have to get the door open on this disconnect to be able to take a voltage reading, to be able to take some amp readings, whatever I need to do here, depending on what I'm trying to repair, what I'm trying to troubleshoot. If it's a piece of equipment, maybe it's a panel board. Excuse me. If it's a panel board, I know I've got to get the cover off of it. I know I've got to get the dead front off of it to be able to troubleshoot. Maybe I think I've got a bad breaker in this panel board. So writing this job safety plan highlights those steps that we're going to use to get this equipment exposed where I can actually do my job. And it's like I said, it's a key aspect of NFPA 70E for the 2018. It's a big change that goes along with it. And I tell qualified people, I tell electricians, we make probably a bigger deal out of this than we need to. If I'm going to go down and troubleshoot on a piece of equipment and I'm qualified to work on that piece of equipment, then as I'm walking down there, I've probably worked on that equipment before. That's part of being qualified, knowing your equipment, knowing your voltage levels, knowing those kind of things. I'm troubleshooting that as I'm headed that direction. I've got my tool card, I've got my tools, I've got my PPE, and as I'm walking down there, I'm thinking about, well, last time I worked on this, what was it? Did we have a blown fuse? Did we blow a control fuse? Did we have a contactor out? So you're kind of making those, you're going through that thought process while you're on your way there. And that thought process, those are the steps that we want to get down on paper. So we spend, like I said, we spend a pretty fair amount of time there talking about those things, and we have to be able to weigh consequence. Basically, if we have to be able to weigh if something does go terribly wrong while we're whatever task we're performing, how bad is it going to get? And that's so there's a matrix that we use. Pull it up on a PowerPoint, look through this matrix, and it's a good example. Now you don't have to use the matrix we have. There's lots of matrix out there to do this, but we spend a pretty fair amount of time there. So module 3, we write the safety steps that we're going to use to be able to do this maintenance order, which is troubleshooting the disconnect switch, basically. So we get into module number 4. It talks about the electrical personal protective equipment. There's some changes there in this 2018 70E. As far as the work practices go, as far as the way we do what we've done in the past, if you've had 2015 70E, those practices really haven't changed much, but the PPE has changed a little bit. Category 0, arc flash PPE category 0 went away in the 2015 70E. It did go away as far as the table is concerned, but there is still basically a category 0. And you have to meet some requirements there, but we still have a category 0. But that's, the PPE is a very important piece of this. We are allowed to work on live parts. We're allowed to test. We're allowed to troubleshoot. If other than that, we have to meet what's called an increased hazard. And we spend time talking about that, of course, but testing and troubleshooting is typically what we do in an energized state. And it's perfectly legal if we have the right skill set, if we're truly qualified, and we have the right personal protective equipment. That's voltage rated gloves, rubber gloves, leather protectors for our shock protection. We have the right test equipment. Insulated tools are involved there for shock. And then, when we talk about arc rated PPE, arc rated clothing, the right arc rated clothing, face shields. It may be 40 calorie switching suits, those kind of things. So, we spend a pretty fair amount of time discussing the PPE requirements, doing our inspections on that PPE when we get it out. A lot of places that I deal with, they wear arc rated clothing as a basic uniform. They wear it every day. And that's a wonderful thing for the electrical workers. But it is PPE and it needs to be inspected. You need to look it over and make sure that you're wearing the right PPE for the right situation if an arc flash or an arc flash should have to occur. And that's a big one. That always has been. And we have to have a very thorough understanding of what that is. The normal operation, module number 5, gets into what they call normal operation of electrical equipment. And we can agree to disagree on this. There's it's new. It was new in the 2015 NFPA 70E. The great debate in the electrical safety business has always been, will the covers on a piece of equipment, if they're all closed up and bolts are in place, will those covers protect me? And NFPA 70E prior to the 2015 edition would always tell you not necessarily. You could not count on the covers to protect you completely. And the 2015 70E came out and they had in a thing called normal operation of electrical equipment. So you have to meet some requirements. There's 6 requirements that have to be met, and we talk about those 6 requirements. It has to be properly installed. It has to be properly maintained. It has to be used in accordance with its listings and any manufacturer's instructions. It has to be used the way the manufacturer intended. It has to have all the covers on it. All the doors have to be closed and secured. All the bolts have to be in place. No evidence of impending failure. If you meet those 6 requirements, NFPA 70E, as a general rule, saying your arc flash hazard is very minimal. We talk about good body positioning, getting off one side or the other, taking a deep breath, making sure your head's positioned in the right direction. So, like I said, whether you agree with it, don't agree with it, it is in the 70E. Companies that don't like this, you can write that out of your policy. It seems to be a point. Everybody seems to have an opinion on this. So a lot of times when we get into that particular section, there's a lot of discussion in the class. Do we agree with it? Do we not agree with it? So that's a great part of the class to be able to get in there and discuss a few things, and we don't necessarily argue about it, but we can there again we can agree to disagree. I have no problem with that. Module number 6 gets into establishing an electrically safe work condition. Lockout tagout. I don't spend typically a huge amount of time here. Most places that have a written lockout tagout program, nearly every place I deal with has that. It's one of the very first things that they train their people on when they hire in, especially their electrical people. They get trained in lockout tagout. I kind of hit the high points. We talk about, how we properly verify. And there again, that's part of the hands-on procedure that we do, is making sure everybody understands how to properly verify. You got to check your meter. You check the circuit's supposed to be de-energized, phase to phase, phase to ground. You recheck the meter when you get done. We talk about those steps that make us, that we know that we are in an electrically safe work condition. And that's our number one goal from an electrical standpoint. Lockout tagout is a way of virtually eliminating the hazard. But there again, you can argue about that eliminating. We're using industry best practice to eliminate a hazard as best we know how. So we're opening disconnects, we're locking breakers open, we're racking breakers out, as the case may be. And that's a good section. It's a good review for lockout tagout. So we talk about the key aspects there. The last one, module number 7, talks about conducting an electrical emergency response drill. There's a few paragraphs in NFPA 70E in the 2018 edition that talk about number 1, contact release. If somebody's being electrocuted, how do you get them out of the equipment and not become part of the problem? We spend a little time there, of course, and we talk about that. There's some paragraphs in 70E that talk about first aid training as far as CPR. If we have AEDs available, we have to have training with those AEDs if we are responsible for responding to these types of emergencies. We spend a little time there and talk about those things. I'm a big fan of everybody being able to do CPR, especially electrical workers, people that have to work around electrical workers. I think everybody, that's my opinion, take it for what it's worth. I'll throw my opinion in here a lot. Take that for what it's worth, but I think everybody should be able to do CPR. Some of these places, guys are remote. We don't have cell phone reception possibly. And we talk about just some of those issues that can come up. Maybe our facility is a big facility, and if you get down in the bowels of the facility, you don't have cell phone reception. Maybe radio reception gets a little sketchy, things like that. If we have an incident, we need to get EMS involved. We need to call 911. How are they going to get into the place? How do they know where to go? The kind of things that people say, well, we talk about it. Well, sometimes it's not just enough to talk about. Sometimes we need to set up a little scenario. And, from an electrical aspect, CPR, AEDs for shock, that's life saving. For arc flash and arc blast, and I'll pose this question. If somebody has set themselves on fire, could you put an AED on them? Could you do CPR on them? There again, depending on how badly they're hurt. So I spend some time talking about those things. We just kind of have an open discussion about in your facility, How are we going to handle some of these things? And if we don't think about those things, and you know, I'm of the opinion, I hope it never happens. And you know, these injuries are horrific. There's no question about that. And I hope it never happens. But it does happen occasionally, and we've got to be prepared for that. We've got to, and I'll tell some stories about some of the things that I've seen over the years where, you know, we thought we were prepared and we thought we did our due diligence, and it didn't really work out that way. But those are the 7 modules that we cover. And like I said, there are some hands-on. There's some there's a lot more interaction in this 2018 70E class that NTT's doing. And I like a class like that. I like people to talk. I like people to ask questions. I like people, let's discuss this. You know, what do you do at your plant? What do you do at your plant? And it makes for a really good class. And sometimes you can make some contacts here in a class like this. We have people coming in from different facilities. You can make some good contacts, people that you can talk to, you know, people you can call. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to protect our people. And we're trying to get our people to buy into this, and that's the idea of NFPA 70E. It's pretty well written. It's a great book, and it's fairly easy to understand if you can separate just a few points as we kind of come through this. So that's kind of the long and short of it. That's the kind of stuff that we talk about. Like I said, I try to have a little fun with it. Like I said, I tell a few war stories of my 31 years of being around the electrical business, and make up some examples, you know, of things that we've done in the past that we're probably not supposed to be doing now. It's just different. Things have changed. You know, I mentioned seat belts. We never wore seat belts, and now everybody wears seat belts. You know, they were mitigating hazard right there. They figured out that it's safer if you stay with the vehicle. You may still be hurt. You may still be killed. And that's the way the electrical PPE is. We do the best we can to protect ourselves, but you may still be hurt. And it's possible in a big arc blast kind of situation that you may still be killed. There's no guarantees here. So part of mitigating risk is looking at those things. And we spend a pretty fair amount of time there looking at those things because they are important. They are very important. So those are the kind of things that that we talk about, that we spend a little time with.
And other than that, Rick, I'm going to talk so close to the 11:30 time frame here, but I figured really fast. I didn't see any questions come through on the chat. So I figured I'd reach out real fast and see if anyone else had any questions. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything pop up again. So really fast, just from both Rick with NTT and also myself here with the Nebraska Safety Council, we appreciate you guys taking a little bit of time out today to join us. And as Rick did mention, we are going to have that full class coming up in November. We'll send you guys just a little bit of follow-up information on that in case you're curious to learn more. And of course, you'll also have my contact information. So if you have some specific questions, especially on anything that Rick had kind of covered quickly about what the class overview is, I'm trying to figure out maybe who on your team needs to get into this type of training. We are here as a resource to make sure that we help you figure out what you need to be doing to protect your workers. So again, thank you all so much for jumping on today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a good week.
Thank you very much.